It's good to see all the familiar faces and the new faces. So welcome to this Adult Ed session. Last time we were dealing with the beginnings of institutionalized American Jewish life with Congregation Sharet Israel. And today we are jumping a few decades, well, actually about a century ahead in history. And we are going to discuss Jewish communal life and challenges the Jewish community was facing in the 1910s and 1920s. And I will present two extraordinary Jewish thinkers, Rabbis Mordechai Kaplan and Bernard Revel, and what the reforms were they suggested to address these challenges the communities, rather in plural, were facing. You are encouraged to interrupt me anytime. I can speak nonstop for an hour, but I realize that, some things might be not clear, or here and there you might want to add something or ask a question or contradict me. That's all absolutely welcome. So feel free to interrupt me anytime there is something you want to say. You are welcome to use the chat box, but I personally prefer it if you unmute yourself and speak, because I'm very bad at looking at the slides and at the chat box at the same time. So please feel free to unmute and let your voices be heard. And I would suggest that we begin. Before we would deal with the works of Kaplan and Revel, I just wanted to give you some background information on the historical and social context in which we are in the 1920s. Probably you have heard about this before, so this will not be entirely new to many of you, but I hope that it will be still useful just to gather information before we start dealing with Mordechai, Kaplan, and Bernard Revel. So first of all, in the late 1800s and early 1900s, more than 2 million Jews arrived in the United States, and most of them come from the Russian Empire, which is not only present-day Russia, but also countries like Lithuania, Latvia, Estonia, Belarus, parts of Poland, Ukraine. So it's bigger than just Russia today. And this is the biggest, largest migration movement in Jewish history from the Russian Empire to the United States. As I said before, between 1880 and 1924, we are going to see soon why this movement stopped in the 1920s. Many of these Jews were fleeing from pogroms, from anti-Semitic violence in the Russian Empire. They were fleeing these experiences with anti-Semitic persecution were, of course, paired with worsening economic and social conditions. Other Jews were trying to flee military service. It is interesting, I think, and important to know that compared to other immigrant populations, only a small percentage of Jews returned to Europe. As you can see on the slides, it was only 7% of Jews who ended up returning from the United States back to their home countries after some years, compared to 32% of non-Jews. We can find many explanations for that. Non-Jewish immigrants like Italian immigrants or Polish immigrants or German immigrants or many of the other European immigrants who arrived in the United States did have home countries to return to. Jews did not. So that is definitely one of the reasons why Jewish immigrants stayed in the US more than non-Jewish immigrants. Apart from that, Jews, of course, had to face anti-Semitism back in Europe, but as we will soon see, they had to face it in the US too, but in different forms. Also, just wanted to know that this is a movement of families, so very often it's only the men, or people perceived as men, who are migrating from one country to the other and then try to support their families back home. But that was not the case for Jewish immigrants. It was a movement of families, and about half of Jewish immigrants were women. And as you can see, about 1/3 of the immigrants were under the age of 14. So this was a movement of families, which is also probably connected to the fact that these immigrants did not return to their home countries, but stayed in the US and tried to make the US their new home. But as we'll soon discuss, that was not always easy. Does anyone maybe want to okay, no, I will not formulate it as a question. As you know, there were migration movements of Jews to the United States before, but never as large as this one. And previous migration movements of Jews to the US included Jews from German-speaking countries. Most of them arrived in the 1840s, so about 4 decades before Jews from Eastern Europe. Many of these Jews fleeing from German-speaking countries in the 1840s were liberal intellectuals who were supporting revolutions against emperors and kings and princes, etc., and moved to the US in the 1840s, who eventually became the Jewish establishment by the end of the 1800s. And the first movement of Jews to the United States was actually before the establishment of the United States, back then when it was the 13 colonies of the British Empire. And many of those Jews were Sephardic Jews from present-day Spain, Portugal. Most of them were merchants. This is something we dealt with in the first session. We skipped the second big movement of German-speaking Central European Jews, and now this is the third wave of Jewish immigrants. And as I said before, it consisted of Eastern European Jews. If there are no questions, I would move on to the next slide, which will address some of the challenges these Jewish immigrants had to face. And one of them was the leading model of ethnic integration in the US, known as the melting pot. Now, generally speaking, I think that the melting pot model has a fairly good reputation, or at least not so bad as other models of ethnic integration. The melting pot model, which was endorsed by the political and cultural elite of the US in the 1910s and early 1920s, and even before that, but it became especially relevant in the 1910s, had this idea that different social groups, different immigrant groups, different religious groups should melt together into a common homogeneous culture. And this common homogeneous culture should eventually become the American culture, the American nationality, the American joint identity. And very often the melting pot model was presented as a better version of the model of ethnic integration known as assimilation. Assimilation was endorsed by the political and cultural elite in Central Europe, most of all. And under assimilation, these Central European elites understood a model where ethnic minorities adapted without any conditions to the norms, principles, traits, practices, customs of the majority. So here there is no melting together in the model of assimilation. Jews, for instance, were expected to abandon religious practices such as circumcision or dietary laws, wearing a yarmulke or whatever, and do whatever members of the majority do. This is a model. So the model of assimilation was especially popular in Central Europe, in German-speaking countries, but not only that, also beyond German-speaking countries. And theoretically, the melting pot model is more advanced than the model of assimilation, because here minorities kind of have an influence on the result, on the end product, on the new joint identity. But there's a problem with this model, with the model of melting pot, that it does not challenge the majority's position. In the case of the United States, despite this whole narrative of a melting pot, despite all the promises of minorities getting a say in the new common American national and cultural identity, those who belong to the Anglo-Protestant elite, at the cultural or political elite, did get to keep their positions and did get to keep their dominance when it comes to culture, but also when it comes to politics. And resentments or even hatred did not cease to exist. Resentments against non-Protestant communities and non-Anglo communities, especially against Catholics. Sentiments against Catholics in the US did not stop despite the promises of this whole melting pot model. And of course, not only against Catholics, but also against Jews. Catholics were very often accused, as you probably know, that they are not loyal to the American president or the American Constitution, but to the Pope, just to name one of the most common stereotypes among American Protestants and Anglo-Protestants, especially in the late 19th century and early 20th century. Even as late as in the 1950s and 60s, that was still an issue. If you look at the press coverage of JFK's presidential campaign, for instance, it was still an issue that he was a Catholic, and JFK was also accused of being disloyal to the American Constitution and being more loyal to the Pope than the US. So even as late as the 1960s, that was still an issue, which to me is a proof for the melting pot model being dysfunctional. If it did not manage to include Catholics and of course Jews, then it's not really a melting pot model, but only a form to guarantee the hegemony, the power of the cultural and political power of those who were in power before this whole model got popularized. Now, I'm happy to talk more about anti-Catholic sentiments, but we are here to discuss anti-Semitism more. So unless there are any questions, I will move on to another aspect of the social and historical context in which Kaplan and Revel worked. Let's study then a bit about anti-Semitism. Sorry about that. So despite all these promises about bringing all the ethnicities, minorities, religious and ethnic minorities together into a new joint culture, as I mentioned before, anti-Semitism was a problem in the US too. It was not restricted to Europe. Just to give you a few examples, in several states across the nation, there were laws, Sunday laws that compelled Jews to close their businesses on Sunday. As you know, Jews traditionally work on Sundays. There were many colleges, social clubs, and other forms of leisure or places of leisure that banned Jews from entering. There is this one famous case from Saratoga in the state of New York, which in hotel management in 1877 denied to accommodate a Jewish banker. And this was like one of the first big cases of the press discussing anti-Semitism in the US. But especially towards the 1920s, these anti-Semitic incidents became even more visible and lethal. Even I gave you a few keywords here. Henry Ford, of course, you know, the entrepreneur businessman who was not hiding his anti-Semitism at all. I brought you an example from his newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, which published a series of anti-Semitic conspiracy myths about the Jews being behind political happenings of the era. Like Ford, for instance, said that it was the Jews who manipulated the American elite into joining World War I, which he vehemently opposed. And so he accused Jews of being communists, he accused Jews of being ruling America and the whole world. So it was basically like the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, but the Americanized version of it, what Henry Ford popularized in his newspaper. The KKK, of course, targeted Black Americans, but also Jews and also Catholics. And can someone tell me who was Leo Frank? Why is his name on this list? Leo Frank was actually a Jewish young man from Georgia who was lynched by an anti-Semitic mob. He was accused of murdering a Christian girl, and there was no proof for his deed, but he's said to be one of the first victims of anti-Semitic mob violence in the US, and that also happened at the beginning of the 20th century. So these are just 3 examples of an era with rising anti-Semitism in the United States. And the rise in the number of anti-Semitic hate crime and hate speech was also paired with anti-immigration sentiments. We have to keep in mind that the absolute majority of Jews in the US were immigrants, first-generation immigrants, maybe some of them second-generation immigrants. And as I said at the very beginning, more than 2 million Jews arrived in this area to the US, which led to immigration restrictions in the 1920s. Some of you might have heard before that the family of Anne Frank actually tried to get to the US, but the US refused them, just like many other Jewish refugees and Jews in Europe who tried to escape before the Nazis would get them. And the reason why Anne Frank's family was refused actually lies in the series of immigration restrictions that was introduced by the US government in the 1920s. And these immigration restrictions restricted the number of Jewish immigrants, not only Jewish, but also immigrants from Southern Europe, from Italy mostly, so immigrants from Catholic countries or countries with a Catholic majority, and immigrants who came from, or Jewish immigrants at the same time. And these restrictions were lifted only in 1965. So this is one of the reasons why many Jews who tried to flee Europe in the 1930s could not flee to the US because of these restrictions. And if you want me to say more about these acts, I'm happy to do that, but there's also a lot to cover. Unless there are any questions, I would move on. Let's move on then. So this is the historical context. As we have seen, it's not easy to be a Jew in the US in the 1910s, 1920s. On the one hand, there is no more Jewish immigration. Jews can't rely anymore on the communities in Europe, on the training of rabbis that was more or less focused on Europe. At the same time, Jews are threatened by assimilation in the US. Jews are threatened by losing their Jewishness in America and becoming part of the homogeneous new collective, whatever that is, probably something that fits the Protestant, Anglo-Protestant norms and practices. So I just wrote up some questions what Jewish communities in these 2 decades kept busy, how to adapt, how to adjust to these new conditions in the US, how to draw upon sources in the US to survive assimilation, and how to overcome the ideals of Eastern European ancestors and create something new for the 20th century American Jew. If you're interested in reading Jewish periodicals from the 1920s, I can absolutely recommend you to look up, for instance, the journal American Hebrew. Many of these discussions took place on the pages of the periodical American Hebrew, or another journal, which was also very important at the time, is the Menorah journal. I'm about to quote from the Menorah journal, so you will hear more about that later. So now that we learned about the historical context, I would like to introduce you to 2 rabbis who had much in common. They were even neighbors and lived in the same apartment building for some time. And that's something I'm going to say more about at the very end of the presentation. But at the same time, they had different ideas of how to be American and how to be Jewish in the 20th century. On the right side, you can see Mordechai Kaplan. Left side is Bernard Revel. Both of them were first-generation immigrants from the Russian Empire and became prominent rabbis in New York. They both agreed that standards of education, the standards of everyday life that they were accustomed, or their families were accustomed to back in Eastern Europe, would not work in the US. So they did agree on the challenges that American Jewry were facing, yet they offered different reforms of Jewish communal life. So in the next, 20 minutes, I'm going to present these 2 lines of thought and how Revel and Kaplan wanted to reform Jewish life in the US. Almost everything I will say about them is based on 2 essays. Kaplan's 1920 essay called A Program for the Reconstruction of Judaism, which was published in the Menorah journal, the journal I mentioned before. And Revel's position I'm going to present are based on his 1926 article, Yeshiva College. This is an article which was not published, but he sent it to a bunch of different Jewish newspapers, and so that's how we know what he thought about education and being American and Jewish. So first, I just wanted to say a few words about Kaplan. He was born, as many of these other Jewish immigrants, in the Russian Empire, in a part of the Russian Empire which is today in Lithuania. He came from an Orthodox Jewish family, a traditional Jewish family. His father moved first to the US and was working there as a rabbi, and his family, his wife and son, Mordechai Kaplan, followed them a few years later. Kaplan studied in Orthodox schools, yeshivot, but at the same time also studied philosophy. I shouldn't say but, sorry. He studied in Orthodox yeshivot and studied philosophy and sociology. at different New York universities and earned a doctorate as well. He also studied at the Jewish Theological Seminary. This institution today is known as the conservative, as the conservative rabbinical school. And it was also affiliated with the conservative ideology back then. But I just want to point out that at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, the differences between conservative Judaism and Orthodox Judaism were not that clear. There were even discussions about uniting the Orthodox Rabbinical Seminary and the conservative Rabbinical Seminary, because the only difference was that the conservative seminary was teaching biblical criticism, which the Orthodox seminary did not. But in practice, students at the conservative seminary were just as observant as students at the Orthodox Rabbinical Seminary. And Kaplan himself was also, without any compromises, religiously observant. And he was actually ordained as a rabbi, by an Orthodox rabbi back in Lithuania. So he was not ordained in the US, but he went back for a few months and then got ordained there. And after his ordination, he began his rabbinic career in Orthodox communities. He was also advisor of a youth movement of Orthodox Jews. And what he is today especially known for is advocating the concept of Jewish community centers. So if you have a JCC in your area, that is probably partially due to Mordechai Kaplan. He did not invent the concept of JCCs, but he was one of the main advocates for this whole idea of Judaism being more than just a synagogue, a house of prayer, Judaism being about community and learning, etc. I'm about to speak to expand on this in a few seconds. And so he was rabbi of the Jewish Center. The Jewish Center was an Orthodox institution that actually believed in this concept of Judaism being more than just religion. So they did have also a lot of educational and leisure activities. That's also in New York. Like all the places I mentioned here are in New York, basically. In New York or Lithuania. These are the two options. And in 1920, Kaplan published the article I mentioned before, a program for the reconstruction of Judaism. And shortly after the publication, he had to leave the Jewish Center. And that was basically the point where he ended up working for Orthodox Jewish establishment, but we'll discuss that later again. So what's up with this article? What did Mordechai Kaplan want? Oh, and also I just want to note, people keep calling him Mordechai Kaplan, but that's not his name. He's Mordechai Kaplan with a K. So you can see it here, for instance. So in this article, which was published in the Menorah Journal, as I mentioned before, one of the most important Jewish publications of the era, Kaplan advocated for Judaism being more than just religion. This is also connected to his idea of the necessity of creating Jewish centers. There's this motto, which for many of us are familiar with, shul with a pool. Shul, of course, stands for synagogue. And even though, as far as I know, that's not a quote that originates from him, I think it's a good description of what Kaplan believed in, which is Judaism being about community and bringing Jews together to do whatever they want to do, but point is together in community, in exchange with each other, learning, engaging in physical exercise or activities, dancing, learning, but not only frontal learning, formal learning, but informal learning, the experience of learning, in dialogue with other Jews. And this is something which he actually could realize in an Orthodox Jewish framework. As we could see, the Jewish Center in Manhattan, where he was working, was an Orthodox institution, and he was the rabbi of that Jewish Center for some years, for some time. But what made him eventually split from the Orthodox Jewish establishment was his skepticism towards traditional theological claims of orthodoxy. He believed that findings of modern sciences, anthropology, historiography, etc., made it impossible for a 20th century person to believe what Orthodox Judaism claims to be important, such as revelation on Sinai or slavery in Egypt, the Exodus, etc. These are all, of course, crucial elements in traditional Jewish theology, and you are expected to believe in these elements. But advances in different disciplines, starting with the late 19th century and then early 20th century, questioned these crucial theological beliefs, and Kaplan advocated for a reconciliation of sciences with theology and religion, which eventually, of course, made him resign from his position at the Orthodox synagogue at the Jewish Center in Manhattan. And I didn't explain versus Reform in the parenthesis. So Reform Judaism at this time, okay, so we understand now where he had a clash with Orthodox Jews. What about Reform Jews? Reform Jews, till the 1930s, denied that Judaism was about peoplehood. The Reform Jews of the late 1800s and early 1900s, Judaism was a religion, just like Protestantism or Catholicism. It was not about ethnicity. And it is for this reason, for instance, that Reform Jews were explicitly anti-Zionist till the 1930s. Officially, the Reform Jewish movement was anti-Zionist because they believed that there's no such thing as a Jewish people. And if there is no such, they were Americans of Jewish faith, and their ethnicity or their ethnic identity was Americanness. And they were Americans who believed in Judaism. That's it. And the same is true for Reform Jews in France. They were Frenchmen of Mosaic faith, of Jewish faith, or the German ones. They were Germans first, and then they had Judaism as confession or denomination. But since they did not believe in Judaism as peoplehood, as ethnicity, they were, of course, also very skeptical of Kaplan. So we see definitely differences between Kaplan's ideas and Reform Judaism, but also Kaplan's ideas and Orthodoxy. And I mentioned before that Kaplan was studying at the Jewish Theological Seminary, which was the leading institution, the flagship institution of conservative Judaism. And later on, he actually became a professor for homiletics at the Jewish Theological Seminary, the conservative seminary. And some argue that with this article, Kaplan wanted to help the conservative movement to find its new identity, somewhere between Orthodoxy and Reform. Did not really work out, but that's a different story. And I will skip. We don't have time for everything. Yeah, I will skip. No, let's speak about cultural Zionism. And also what's important about Kaplan, that he advocated for Hebrew, to learn Hebrew as a language for Jews in diaspora, and he strongly believed that there should be an exchange, a cultural exchange between Jews living in the United States and living in Palestine, which also made him have conflicts with the Jewish establishment. As I mentioned before, the Jewish establishment of the era was dominated by German Jews who came in the 1840s. And these German Jews were predominantly Reform. They were adherents of the Reform movement who again, as we have already heard, did not believe that Judaism was an ethnicity, and for this reason, they did not support any kind of exchange with Jews living elsewhere, Jews belonging to other nationalities. Okay, so after Kaplan left the Jewish Center, he and others who were members at the Jewish Center at this Orthodox institution established the Society for Advancement of Judaism. You can see their building on the right side in Manhattan. Everything is in Manhattan. Everything I tell you about is in Manhattan, basically. And Kaplan, in his article in the 1950 article, said that the society will do adult education works for all Jews, and only incidentally, in addition to this work, conduct other activities such as Hebrew school, synagogue, and social activities. So he makes it clear that this new society has to be more than just a house of prayer. It has to be a space where Jews can live their Jewishness in different ways and different forms. It was also important for Kaplan, as I mentioned before, to combine traditional learning with modern sciences, social sciences, Hebrew literature. He even had lectures on the history of Jewish women. And it was here in the Society for Advancement of Judaism where the first bat mitzvah of humanity took place. I mean, there were bat mitzvah celebrations before, but the girls didn't have to do much. And here in the bat mitzvah for Kaplan's daughter, for Judith Kaplan, Judith had to read from the Torah, just like boys would do, and other rituals, participate in other rituals. And this year it will be the 100 years that the first public celebration of bat mitzvah took place. And I will also mention at this point that at the convention of Reconstructing Judaism, which is going to happen in March 2022, there will be a special celebration for the 100 years anniversary of Judith Kaplan's bat mitzvah. And Kaplan didn't stop working towards the reconstruction of Judaism. He published several books after the establishment of the Society for Advancement of Judaism, and died in 83 at the age of 102. And as many of you know, the present-day Reconstructing Judaism movement is rooted in the ideas of Kaplan. Kaplan himself was not that much involved in creating the movement. He initially didn't even want to have a new movement established, but as I said before, was more about giving a new direction to the conservative movement. Yet eventually a new movement was established officially in the 1960s, which is known today as Reconstructing Judaism, was known till a few years ago as Reconstructionist Judaism. Now, unless there are any questions on Kaplan and his ideas, I would like to move on and speak about Revel. We can also discuss questions at the end of the presentation. As I have already mentioned, Kaplan and Revel have pretty similar biographies. They were born just a few years apart from each other, and they were born in the same region. Again, Russian Empire, now in Lithuania. Revel was also the son of a rabbi, and the difference is that he did not come to the US together with his parents like Kaplan did, but on his own. He was involved in the first Russian Revolution. This is not the one which was which was led by the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. This is the previous one. And after this, he was imprisoned for his activities. After his release from prison, he emigrated to the US and began his rabbinical studies at the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. This was the only Orthodox seminary in the US at this point, which was established in the late 1800s by Orthodox rabbis who did not want to be affiliated with the Jewish Theological Seminary, with the conservative seminary, because of their emphasis on biblical criticism. So they established a more or less traditional rabbinical seminary under the name of Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary. This seminary is today part of Yeshiva University. So it's a seminary which still exists. And apart from his rabbinical studies, Revel also studied comparative religion and philosophy. So there is another commonality between Revel and Kaplan. They definitely had similar interests. And there is a Philadelphia connection here for those of you who are in Pennsylvania. So Revel got a position as assistant rabbi in Philadelphia, and during his time as assistant rabbi, he attended courses at Temple. He took all kinds of different courses, not only about Judaism, but also other religions, like Hindu philosophy, and eventually earned a doctorate at Dropsy College. This is a college which does not exist anymore, but there is now the Katz Center for Advanced Judaic Studies, which is an institute of the University of Pennsylvania, and the Katz Center is kind of connected to the Dropsy College. Anyway, and it was a newly established. It's a newly established institute back then, and Revel was the first graduate. And after his graduation, he was appointed to be the Rabbi Isaac Elchanan Theological Seminary's president, which made him leave Philadelphia and return to New York. And he implemented changes to modernize Orthodox rabbinical training, such as introducing courses in homiletics and Jewish history. And what's interesting for us is his plans on establishing a school that would combine Jewish traditional education with liberal arts and humanities education. And this school was eventually the Yeshiva College, established in 1928. And he first proposed this school in an article which was entitled Yeshiva College. It's a very creative name for an article. And as I mentioned before, he sent this article to a bunch of different newspapers. It was yet not published. Anyway, in this article, Revel argued that American Jews need a new Jewish university that would advocate for a union of American culture and Jewish spirituality. And Revel also emphasized that secular or worldly knowledge is nothing separate from the study of Torah, from the study of traditional Jewish literature. So he definitely advocated for a unification, for a synthesis of Americanness and Jewishness. But at the same time, he was, of course, a stringent Orthodox Jew who did not compromise on religious observances. And his article and proposals and other public statements on the soon-to-be established Yeshiva College led to a lot of controversies, especially among liberal and secular Jews. Revel was accused of fueling anti-Semitism, and in some publications, also in the American Hebrew, which I mentioned before, being one of the two most important publications of the era, the American Hebrew accused Bernard Revel of fueling anti-Semitism by insisting of establishing a Jewish university. To them, that was a problem and a hurdle for Jewish integration, for Jewish participation in American society. At the same time, his idea of establishing a Jewish university got support from presidents of a variety of universities, such as from the president of Columbia University, but they supported him from the wrong reasons. They supported the idea of establishing a Jewish university because they knew that anti-Semitism was a huge issue at their universities, and they wanted to have a Jewish university where they can send all the Jewish students so they won't be harassed anymore by anti-Semitism on campus. And of course, that's not what Revel wanted. He wanted to establish a university that was a real respected university where Jews can be Jews and Jews can be Americans at the same time, can pursue research. But he didn't envision the Yeshiva College to be a haven for refugees from Columbia University or Harvard. He wanted this to be an outstanding institution of higher education. But that's not what all these other universities understood in his vision. And so even though he got a lot of support from the academic elite of the US, they supported him from the wrong reasons, at least from the perspective of Revel. Nevertheless, he, partially because of all the support coming from these very important academic leaders, he managed to establish the Yeshiva College. The first semester took place in the Jewish Center. If you remember, that's the synagogue where Kaplan was the rabbi just 8 years before the establishment of Yeshiva College. So the first classes attended attended the program in the Jewish Center first, and then Yeshiva College moved into its own building in Manhattan, and you can see Yeshiva College on the image. It is a fascinating building. If you haven't seen it yet, I wholeheartedly recommend you to visit it in New York. And until today, this building serves as under the name Yeshiva College, and it's part of the Yeshiva University system. And this is where you can get an undergrad degree in liberal arts, for instance. And Revel required rabbinical students to get an undergrad degree in humanities and liberal arts before moving on to rabbinical studies. And he remained the president of Yeshiva College till his death in 1940. But as we can see, his influence has lasted much longer, and this is more or less the model what Yeshiva College and Yeshiva University are doing today. So that's all based on the idea of Revel and his 1926 proposal for the establishment of a Jewish institution that will combine Jewish learning with so-called secular liberal arts and humanities. And before I would close this presentation, I just wanted to introduce you to a theory of Jonathan Sarna. You probably know Professor Sarna. He's a historian. He is the author of the book American Judaism, which is, in my opinion, one of the best books on American Jewish history. And he has published many other books and articles. And Sarna mentioned that there is this idea of a synthesis between Americanness and Jewishness, which is different than assimilation because it's not about Jews becoming Americans and abandoning their Jewishness, but about Jews becoming American and remaining Jews at the same time. And Sarna writes that Jews attempted to transform America's vision of itself by undercutting the claims of Christian America and promoting pluralism as a national idea. They attempted to forge a new America, one where they might finally be accepted as insiders. And this is, in my opinion, this theory of cult of synthesis can be applied both to Kaplan and his works, but also to Revel and his works. Kaplan, by emphasizing the importance of sciences, scientific advancements by establishing the Society for Advancement of Judaism, where they were not only discussing traditional Jewish literature, but contemporary social issues, for instance, learning about social sciences. Revel by establishing Yeshiva College, where the students were not only required to study Talmud, but also to study ethics. And these two are just two examples of how Jewish intellectuals of the 1920s tried to make America a home for all people. And I wanted to close with a quote by Mordechai Kaplan. Some of you might know that Mordechai Kaplan had a diary and wrote a lot about his encounters with other intellectuals of the era, or his personal thoughts, his theology, philosophy. I really enjoy reading his diary. You can find much of his diary already published. I think there are right now 4 volumes available to the public, but there's more in the archives, in the library of the Reconstructionist Rabbinical College. Anyway, and as I mentioned at the very beginning, for some time, Kaplan and Revel were neighbors. They were living in the same apartment building. And even though they knew each other and they knew about each other, as far as I know, this is the only proof for a personal encounter, for a conversation between the two. And I will ask someone to read this quote. I think it's pretty nice. So this is written by Mordechai Kaplan about his encounter with Revel.
I'll read it. On one of my return trips this week, I fell in with Dr. Bernard Revel, the present head of the yeshiva. Although he has been living in New York in the same house with me, we have never visited each other. I avoided him because I had been warned that he is not altogether trustworthy. Although I could have avoided him this time too, I did not do so. We had a very interesting conversation. He maintained that Judaism emphasized this worldliness as opposed to otherworldliness and soul-saving tendency of Christianity. I took issue with him on that score because I believe that we cannot attribute to Judaism any particular philosophy of life. He spoke very intelligently and used a remarkably good English, although he stammered once in a while. This particularly surprised me in a man who, on the one hand, possesses a reputation for Jewish learning of the kind one meets with only in Eastern Europe, and on the other hand, is quite familiar with the literature of Jewish science. As we parted, he said, "This has been a revelation to me. I hope there will be no more. Will no more be any misunderstanding between us."
Thank you so much, Deborah. I hope you enjoyed this trip to the past and learning about Kaplan and Revel and their personal encounter in the staircase, right? I think they met somewhere on the stairs. I will now, also I wanted to mention, these are the main sources I used for this presentation. If any of you is interested and want to learn more, I'm happy to provide you more sources. This is my email address, and don't hesitate to get in touch. And that's all from me for today. Thank you all for listening. And if there are any questions or remarks, or this is the time for you to address them.
I will just mention that I live in Houston, Texas, and Daniel Musher is the grandson of Mordechai Kaplan. And so it's very interesting to be living in a community where he's an MD doctor, retired, but quite accomplished in his Jewish knowledge, intellectual knowledge, his being a doctor. He's a violinist in some sort of concert group. And it's just been wonderful to live in the community where he is and kind of see he and his wife and how they embrace his grandfather's philosophy. Even they belong to the big conservative congregation here, but you can just see how they emulate the thought process of Mordechai Kaplan. So it's just, you brought him more to life, but it's just fun to know what I know about him from the grandson. So anyway, thank you.
Thank you. I guess I will have to go to Houston and meet them.
He's a fabulous man. He's so bright. I served with him on the Jewish Book Fair committee over many years, and his knowledge and breadth of knowledge was just always blew my mind. So, but it's easy to see where he came from it naturally. So.
I always feel bad when you ask if there are any questions, because I know that I want to have your teaching, like, take the time to put YouTube on the PS5 so that I can have you replaying as many times as I do any documentaries as I watch, and eventually I'll have questions, because I never have questions right in the moment.
That's all right. You have my email address. If you have questions in 2 days or 4 months or 7 years, then contact me.
And we have a class coming up next month that will be in our emails, which is Biblical Themes in Opera with Rabbi Steve Nathan. And so keep tuned to the emails for the sign up link for that. And I want to thank everyone for joining us today.
Thank you.
Liz,
Thank you all.
I'm also going to talk about the fact that for those of you who are in the Allentown area, Rabbi Denise Egger, who is the founder of Congregation Kolami in West Hollywood, who is sort of recon and reform kind of combined, is going to be speaking here in the Valley, January 24th. At
Spirituality Symposium, right?
Right. It's the Spirituality Symposium that we've been talking about. So we've done them a bunch of times. And those of you who are here in the Lehigh Valley, they're coming January 24th. So heads up, save the date.
That will be in our emails as well.
Yep.
So,
And I don't know, both are, I don't see whether they are both online and in person. I'm not sure.
that I can confirm with him.
Yes, but anyway.
Great.
I know the daytime thing for clergy is not online and in person, but the evening thing, I'm not sure. It might be broadcast. But yeah, that's really cool. Kind of reconstructing things for a different purpose.
I like it. Awesome. Well, thank you everyone for joining us today.